Margaret Holloway slammed the shovel into the dry pasture, dropped another tiny oak seedling into the ground, and packed the soil around its roots before the wind could steal the last bit of moisture. A loud horn blasted behind her. She didn't turn around. Seconds later, laughter rolled across the field. "Margaret!" a man shouted from a dusty pickup truck. "Planning to grow a forest instead of paying your bills?" Another voice chimed in. "She should have sold the farm months ago." The men laughed harder. Margaret kept working. She lifted the battered watering can, poured a slow stream of water around the seedling, and whispered, "You'll make it." The truck drove away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and another round of mocking laughter. Margaret stood slowly and looked across the 40-acre pasture. Once, the land had carried healthy cattle and thick green grass. Now the soil was cracked, patches of weeds had replaced nutritious forage, and spring rains carved deep channels through the hillsides. Every year the pasture produced less, and every year more neighbors insisted there was only one sensible solution: sell the farm. She refused. Not because it was easy, because she had made a promise. Only 6 months earlier, life had looked completely different. Whispering Creek Farm had been noisy with plans, laughter, and dreams. Margaret and her husband, Samuel Holloway, had spent evenings sitting on the porch with mugs of coffee, talking about everything they wanted to build together. "We'll fix the barn first," Samuel had said one evening. Margaret laughed. "You've been saying that for 3 years. This time I mean it." "And after the barn? A new fence. And after that?" Samuel looked across the pasture as the sun disappeared behind the hills. "I want to bring the land back." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean? It wasn't always like this." He scooped a handful of soil from the flower bed beside the porch. "My grandfather used to tell me this valley was alive. Deer crossed these fields every morning. Birds nested everywhere. There were trees along every stream. So what happened? We cleared almost everything. For cattle." Samuel nodded. It made sense back then. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "I have." "What would you do?" He smiled. "I'd plant thousands of native trees." Margaret laughed. "In the pasture?" "Especially in the pasture. You'd lose grazing land. I might gain something better." She nudged him gently. "You really are serious." "I've never been more serious." She kissed his cheek. "Then one day we'll do it." Neither of them imagined that one day would arrive without him. 3 weeks later, Samuel was driving home from a supply store when a speeding truck crossed the center line. The phone call reached Margaret just after sunset. She remembered every word. "There has been an accident." By sunrise, everything had changed. The funeral brought nearly the entire community together. People hugged her. They cried with her. They promised to help. But after the casseroles disappeared and the flowers faded, reality settled over Whispering Creek Farm. Bills kept arriving. The tractor needed repairs. The barn roof leaked every time it rained. The pasture produced almost no income. The mortgage payment was due in less than a month. Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table surrounded by unopened envelopes. She quietly whispered, "What do I do now, Sam?" The silence hurt more than the debt. A week later, Walter Briggs knocked on her front door. Walter owned the largest cattle operation in Pine Ridge County. He removed his hat respectfully. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. I'll get straight to the point." Margaret nodded. "I figured you would." Walter looked toward the pasture. "You can't run this place by yourself." "I know. You've got 40 acres losing money." "I know. You've got equipment that needs replacing." "I know. The market isn't getting any easier." "I know that too." Walter hesitated before speaking again. "I'll make you a fair offer." Margaret folded her arms. "For what?" "The farm." She stared at him. "I'm not selling." "You haven't heard my price." "I don't need to. You should think about your future." "I am. You've still got your whole life ahead of you." "I know. You could start over." Margaret smiled politely. "This is where my life started." Walter sighed. "Sentiment doesn't pay bills." "No. Then what will?" Margaret looked across the pasture. "I haven't figured that out yet." Walter shook his head. "When you do call me." He walked back to his truck. Before driving away, he rolled down the window. "Don't wait too long." Margaret watched the truck disappear beyond the hill. The words echoed in her mind. Don't wait too long. That evening she climbed into the attic searching for old financial records. Instead she found a wooden box tucked beneath a dusty blanket. Inside lay dozens of notebooks. Every one belonged to Samuel. She carried them downstairs. Most contained ordinary farm records. Feed costs, rainfall, equipment repairs. But one notebook looked different. Across the front, written in Samuel's handwriting, were 4 simple words. "For our future forest." Margaret slowly opened it. The first page held a hand-drawn map of the pasture. Small circles covered nearly every hillside. Beside each circle Samuel had written the name of a native tree. Oak, sugar maple, white pine, red cedar, paper birch, wild cherry. Further into the notebook were pages filled with sketches, wildlife lists, soil notes, and ideas for restoring the creek. Then she reached the final page. Her hands began to tremble. At the bottom, Samuel had written, "If you're reading this without me, please don't let anyone convince you this land is beyond saving. People will tell you to sell it. They'll tell you trees won't pay the bills. Maybe they're right in the beginning. But someday these trees will protect this farm, bring life back to this valley, and remind people that the best time to plant hope is when everyone else has given up." A tear slipped onto the page. Margaret gently wiped it away. The next morning, instead of driving into town to meet a real estate agent, she drove to the nearest native tree nursery. The young employee looked at her shopping list twice. "I'm sorry," he said. "Are these quantities correct?" Margaret smiled. "They are. You want oak, maple, birch, cedar, pine." "That's right." He looked puzzled. "How many acres are you planting?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "Eventually." She smiled toward the truck parked outside. 40. The young man blinked. "Ma'am, are you starting a forest?" Margaret looked at the first rays of sunlight spilling across the valley. "No." She smiled through eyes still carrying the grief of losing Samuel. "I'm finishing a dream." Margaret drove through the gate with the back of her old pickup loaded with trays of native seedlings. Oak, sugar maple, white pine, paper birch, red cedar, and wild cherry filled the truck bed. The nursery employee had wished her luck, but his expression made it clear he thought she was making a terrible mistake. She parked beside the pasture, climbed onto the tailgate, and carefully lifted the first tray into her arms. "This one's for you, Sam," she whispered. By sunset, 12 tiny trees stood in the middle of the worn-out pasture. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The next morning she planted 15 more. The day after that, 23. Then 30. She settled into a routine. Before sunrise, she milked the 2 remaining dairy cows, fed the chickens, and checked the vegetable garden. After breakfast, she spent hours digging holes, mixing homemade compost into the soil, planting seedlings, and carrying buckets of water from the creek. Every evening she crossed another few trees off Samuel's map. One afternoon, she was kneeling beside a young maple when another pickup truck pulled onto the shoulder. Walter Briggs stepped out, followed by 2 neighboring ranchers. "Morning," Walter called. Margaret looked up. "Morning." Walter studied the rows of seedlings. "So the rumors are true." "I suppose they are. You've actually started planting." "I have." One of the ranchers burst into laughter. "I told you she'd lost her mind." Walter folded his arms. "Margaret, can we talk some sense into you?" "You can try." He pointed toward the nearest row of tiny oaks. "Do you know what those trees are going to do? They're going to grow. They're going to take up grazing land. They might. They won't earn you money. Not today. You already owe the bank." "I know. You need cattle." Margaret shook her head. "No." Walter frowned. "No. I need healthy land." The second rancher laughed. "Healthy land doesn't pay mortgages." Margaret calmly stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. "It can." "When?" She smiled. "Give it time." Walter sighed. "Time is the one thing you don't have." The men climbed back into their truck, still shaking their heads. As they drove away, one shouted through the open window, "You'll be bankrupt before those trees are taller than your boots." Margaret watched the dust settle. Then she picked up another seedling. "I've heard worse," she whispered. A week later, another letter arrived from the bank. She unfolded it slowly. The words tightened her chest. Her loan payments were overdue. Unless she presented a workable financial plan within 90 days, the bank could begin foreclosure proceedings. Margaret lowered the letter onto the kitchen table. For the first time since Samuel's death, doubt crept into her heart. "What if they're right?" she whispered into the empty room. She walked onto the porch carrying Samuel's notebook. The evening breeze flipped through its pages until it stopped at one sentence he had underlined twice. "The hardest part of restoring land isn't planting trees. It's surviving long enough to see them grow." Margaret smiled through tears. "I'll survive." The following Saturday, while she was repairing tree guards near the creek, she noticed a young man climbing over the fence carrying a backpack. He stopped several yards away. "Mrs. Holloway?" "Yes. My name is Caleb Brooks." She walked toward him. "Can I help you?" "I hope so." He smiled nervously. "I graduated from the Provincial School of Forestry last spring." "Congratulations." "Thank you. I've been looking for work. I'm afraid I can't hire anyone." "I'm not asking for a job." Margaret looked surprised. "I'm asking if I can volunteer." She blinked. "You'd volunteer here?" Caleb nodded. "I've heard people talking." "I'm sure you have. They say a young widow is planting thousands of trees in the middle of a cattle pasture. They aren't wrong. I wanted to see it myself. And..." He slowly looked across the field. Rows of tiny seedlings stretched toward the distant hills. "I think you're trying to build something people don't understand yet." Margaret studied him for a moment. "Most people call it foolish." Caleb smiled. "The greatest restoration projects usually do." She couldn't help smiling back. "When can you start?" "I brought work gloves." She laughed for the first time in weeks. "Then I suppose you've already started." Over the next month, the farm became busier than it had been since Samuel was alive. Caleb tested soil. Margaret built compost piles from leaves, manure, and old hay. Together they installed protective wire cages around vulnerable seedlings. They repaired sections of the creek bank using native shrubs. Every evening they marked another completed section on Samuel's map. One afternoon Caleb knelt beside a handful of dark compost. "This is incredible." Margaret looked over. "What is?" "You made this." She nodded. "Mostly kitchen scraps, leaves, chicken manure, and old straw." He scooped some into his hand. "It's full of earthworms. They came back this spring." He looked around thoughtfully. "You know what that means?" "What?" "The soil is starting to wake up." Margaret smiled. "I've been hoping someone would say that." A few days later, 11-year-old Lily Carter appeared at the gate holding a small watering can almost as big as she was. Margaret smiled. "Hello." "Hi. What brings you here?" Lily looked down shyly. "My dad says you're wasting your time." Margaret nodded. "He isn't the only one." The little girl looked toward the tiny forest. "I don't think you're wasting it." Margaret smiled warmly. "You don't." Lily shook her head. "I think it's pretty." Margaret laughed softly. "That's the nicest thing anyone said all week." Lily lifted the watering can. "I came to help." Margaret handed her a small birch seedling. "Then this one is yours." The girl's eyes lit up. "Really? You plant it?" Lily carefully dug a hole, lowered the seedling into place, and patted the soil with both hands. "What kind of tree is it?" "A paper birch." "Will it get big?" "Someday." "Will I still be able to see it when I'm grown up?" Margaret smiled. "If someone takes care of it." "I will." Word spread through Ashford Hollow that children had started visiting the widow's farm. Some parents smiled. Others rolled their eyes. At Miller's General Store, Walter Briggs poured himself another cup of coffee. "Now she's got kids planting trees." One rancher chuckled. "Maybe she's starting a summer camp." Laughter filled the room. Old Frank Donovan, who had remained quiet until then, finally spoke. "You boys laugh an awful lot." Walter looked over. "What's that supposed to mean?" Frank shrugged. "I've noticed something." "What?" "She's out there every single day." So are you." Walter frowned. What are you talking about? Frank smiled. You keep driving past her farm. The room fell quiet. Walter shifted uncomfortably. I just happen to use that road. Frank nodded. Of course you do. Walter didn't answer. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Margaret stood beside the very first oak she had planted. The tiny leaves fluttered gently in the breeze. She reached down and touched them with one finger. You made it, she whispered. She had no idea that before another spring arrived, something would happen in that pasture that even the harshest critics wouldn't be able to explain away. It would be the first unmistakable sign that the land was finally beginning to heal, and it would force the entire town to look at her little forest with new eyes. Spring arrived with 3 days of gentle rain. Margaret stood on the porch before sunrise, wrapped in her old work jacket, watching the water soak into the hillside instead of rushing down it. She smiled. You're holding together, she whispered to the land. She grabbed her boots and headed for the pasture. Caleb was already there, kneeling beside the creek. Come look at this, he called. Margaret hurried over. Caleb pointed to the muddy bank. At first she saw nothing. Then she smiled. Deer tracks. Fresh ones. She looked around. They were here last night. Caleb nodded. They haven't crossed this pasture in years. Margaret ran her fingers gently along one of the prints. Welcome home. As they continued walking, another surprise waited. A pair of bright bluebirds darted from a young maple and landed on a nearby fence post. Lily came running through the gate carrying her binoculars. I saw them. I saw them. Margaret laughed. So did we. They're making a nest. Caleb raised the binoculars. They certainly are. Lily looked at Margaret with wide eyes. Does this mean your trees are working? Margaret smiled. No. What? It means nature has decided to trust us again. Within weeks, more life returned. Monarch butterflies floated across the meadow. Honeybees buzzed from flower to flower. Wild rabbits appeared beneath the cedars. Songbirds filled the mornings with music. Even the creek, once muddy after every storm, now flowed clear. Neighbors began slowing their trucks when they drove past. Some still laughed. Others simply stared. Walter Briggs stopped one afternoon but didn't get out. He watched a family of deer disappear into the young trees before quietly driving away. The following month, a White County vehicle pulled into the farmyard. A woman stepped out carrying a camera, a notebook, and a clipboard. Mrs. Holloway? Margaret nodded. I'm Rebecca Lawson from Pine Ridge County. Margaret wiped the soil from her hands. Is something wrong? Rebecca smiled. Actually, something appears to be very right. She spent the next several hours walking every corner of the farm. She photographed native flowers. She counted bird species. She measured tree growth. She collected soil samples. Finally, she stood beside the creek, shaking her head in amazement. I've read reports about projects like this. And I've never seen one started by one determined young widow. Margaret smiled. I wasn't alone. Rebecca looked around. I don't see a large organization. Margaret looked toward the sky. I didn't mean that kind of help. Rebecca understood. 2 months later, the local newspaper arrived. Across the front page was a large photograph of Margaret standing beside one of the growing maples. The headline read, Young Widow's Forest Brings Life Back to Dying Farm. By noon, the story had spread across Pine Ridge County. Cars began arriving almost every weekend. Some visitors wanted advice. Others simply wanted proof that the newspaper hadn't exaggerated. Margaret welcomed them all. One Saturday morning, 3 ranchers walked through the gate. Margaret recognized every one of them. They were the same men who had laughed at her months earlier. None of them were smiling now. Walter removed his hat. I owe you an apology. Margaret looked surprised. For what? For believing you were throwing your life away. She smiled gently. I never took it personally. I did. Walter lowered his eyes. I laughed. I remember. I shouldn't have. Margaret stepped closer. You weren't the only one. Walter looked across the pasture. Rows of healthy young trees stretched toward the hills. Birdsong echoed through the valley. I've never seen this many birds on farmland. Margaret smiled. They were waiting for someone to make room. Walter took a deep breath. My north pasture isn't doing well. She listened quietly. I was wondering. He hesitated. If you'd help me plant some trees. Margaret couldn't help smiling. I'd be honored. Within weeks, Caleb was helping Walter design shelter belts. Other farmers asked questions. Some planted trees beside creeks. Others restored wetlands. Several began making compost instead of burning leaves. Ashford Hollow slowly changed. People who once measured success only by the number of cattle now talked about healthy soil, clean water, and wildlife. 1 year later, Pine Ridge County organized a community celebration at Whispering Creek Farm. Families filled the meadow. Children played beneath the growing maples. Food vendors lined the entrance road. Musicians performed on a small wooden stage. Rebecca stepped to the microphone. Today we celebrate someone who reminded us that one person's courage can transform an entire community. The crowd applauded. Margaret looked uncomfortable. Caleb whispered, "Just enjoy it." Rebecca continued. When Margaret Holloway lost her husband, many believed this farm's story had ended. She paused. They were wrong. More applause followed. Instead of selling, she chose hope. Margaret slowly walked onto the stage. The audience rose to its feet. She waited until the applause faded. "I don't really like giving speeches," she admitted, making everyone laugh. "So I'll simply tell you the truth." The crowd became quiet. There were mornings I wanted to quit. She glanced toward the first oak she had planted. There were nights I wondered if everyone else was right. She looked at Walter and smiled. "No offense." The audience laughed. Walter laughed the loudest. But every time I thought about giving up. She held up Samuel's worn notebook. I remembered one sentence my husband wrote. She opened the final page. "The best time to plant hope is when everyone else has given up." Silence settled across the crowd. Margaret closed the notebook. "I wasn't trying to grow a forest." She looked across the hillside. "I was trying to keep a promise." Many people wiped away tears. Lily, now a little older, stood beside the paper birch she had planted years earlier. It was already taller than she was. She smiled proudly. "I told Dad this place would be beautiful." Margaret laughed. "You certainly did." Several months later, the county officially protected the woodland as a community conservation area. A handcrafted cedar sign was placed beside the entrance. It read, "Holloway Forest Preserve." One promise. Thousands of trees. Endless hope. Years passed. The saplings became towering trees. Their branches shaded walking trails where bare ground had once baked in the sun. The creek sparkled beneath the canopy. Children who had planted seedlings returned as adults with children of their own. One quiet autumn afternoon, Margaret walked slowly along the same trail where she had once carried buckets of water by herself. Caleb walked beside her. "Listen," he said. She stopped. The forest was alive. Birds sang from every direction. Leaves rustled overhead. A distant woodpecker tapped against an old oak. The gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth. Margaret closed her eyes. "It sounds exactly the way Sam said it would." Caleb smiled. "You kept his dream alive." Margaret looked up through the canopy. "No." She gently rested her hand against the trunk of the very first oak she had planted. "We kept it alive." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage, resilience, and rural life, and leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were Margaret?